Zora stood in the center of the council hall, her towering presence barely contained beneath the weight of the gaze upon her. The towering marble columns, glistening under the artificial sunlight, echoed with whispers from every corner. But Zora wasn't paying attention to the architecture. Her eyes were locked on the face of the High Chancellor, whose lips moved in a rhythm she could no longer follow. The words coming from his mouth felt distant, irrelevant, like the murmur of a passing storm. And thus, it is decreed that all female aliens shall take a human mate within the year. The words crashed into Zora with the force of a tidal wave, her body stiffening as though struck by an unseen force. Her breath caught in her throat, her mind scrambling to process the unthinkable. A law, this new law, was not just a decree, it was a sentence. A punishment for what? For simply existing, for being an alien? It didn't matter. Behind the Chancellor's ceremonial robes, the faces of the council members stared back at her with impassive eyes, their expressions unreadable. But they were not the source of her tension. Her gaze flickered to the human standing on the opposite side of the room. Lucas. He was tall, muscular, his sharp features not quite handsome, but striking in their intensity. His dark brown eyes met hers for just a moment before he quickly looked away, his mouth set in a hard line. The human soldiers standing beside him were silent, but she could sense the unease vibrating through them, through him. They were all thinking the same thing. How had this happened? How had they come to this point? The idea of her, an alien, being forcibly paired with a human mate was incomprehensible. Zora's species had never lived in such an unequal balance before. The humans had been the invaders once, but now, it was the aliens who would be forced to adapt. She inhaled sharply, the air filled with the sterile scent of the council hall, cold, metallic, devoid of warmth. The law was not just an inconvenience, it was a symbol. A symbol of dominance, of control. And Zora would not allow herself to be reduced to something so powerless. Do you accept the terms of this new law, Zora Valeth? The High Chancellor's voice broke through her thoughts, dragging her back into the moment. Her name hung in the air like a bitter curse. Her gaze hardened, her jaw clenching. The room fell into silence, waiting for her answer. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching her break. No, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She spoke it with such force, the words echoed through the hall, carrying a clarity of resolve. I do not accept this. A murmur rippled through the council members, their eyes flickering with surprise, but none of them dared to challenge her openly. Zora had always been a force, both in body and in mind, and she would not be cowed by any decree, no matter how powerful its origin. Then, the Chancellor's voice faltered, his composure slipping ever so slightly. You leave us no choice. The consequences will be grave. Then let them come, Zora replied, her voice steady. She turned, preparing to walk away, but just before she reached the door, something stopped her. Lucas. He stood in her way, his posture unyielding. His face was a mixture of confusion and something darker, resentment, perhaps. The air between them crackled with an intensity that was unmistakable. I've heard of your people's pride, he said, his voice low and rough, but I didn't expect it to come with such arrogance. Zora's eyes narrowed, her fists balling at her sides. She felt the sharp sting of his words, the subtle insult that carried more weight than he likely intended. But she wasn't about to back down, not in front of him. Arrogance? Zora's voice dripped with disdain. Is it arrogant to want to choose my own fate? Or is it arrogant to force me into a life that I didn't ask for? Lucas's jaw tightened, his dark eyes burning with an edge she hadn't anticipated. You're not the only one forced into this, he shot back, stepping closer, his body nearly brushing against hers. We all have a say, but we're all bound by the law. Zora's breath hitched at his proximity. There was a rawness to his words, a vulnerability hidden beneath the rough edges of his anger. He was frustrated, yes, but there was something else, something far more complex in his tone. Something she hadn't expected to hear from a human. He wasn't just angry, he was afraid. A thought flickered in her mind. Could he possibly understand her plight, even if only a little? Before she could respond, the sound of boots echoed down the hall. The soldiers began to move, and Lucas took a step back, his expression hardening again as if he were trying to reclaim control over himself. Zora could feel the sudden shift in the air. The walls felt closer now, the space between them shrinking in a way that left her feeling unsettled. "You'll find out soon enough what happens when you defy the law," Lucas muttered, his voice barely audible. She watched him walk away, the cold weight of his words lingering in her mind. As the heavy doors to the council hall closed behind her, Zora felt a strange, unexpected twist in her gut. It wasn't fear. No, it was something else, something far more insidious. Curiosity. Her mind replayed his words, the heat in his eyes, the pulse of energy that passed between them in those brief moments. The law had declared her fate, but she was beginning to wonder if this law would be the thing that led her down a path she never saw coming. Zora's hand grazed the doorframe, her heart pounding as she left the hall. There was something about Lucas she couldn't ignore, something that gnawed at her as she stepped into the cold corridors of the complex. The law would bind them together, whether she wanted it or not. But for the first time in her life, Zora didn't know if she could fight what was already starting to grow between them. The corridors of the council building were eerily silent as Zora paced down them, the sound of her boots echoing off the cold stone walls. She had expected the weight of the new law to settle on her like a tangible thing, like a shackle around her wrists, but there was no immediate change. No visible mark to show that she'd been branded. It had only been a few hours since the council's announcement, but already, she felt as though she were suffocating beneath the pressure of it all. How could they force her, force any of us, to submit to this? Her thoughts churned, twisting and tangling in her mind like a storm that wouldn't stop raging. Each step she took led her to another question, another uncertainty. What would happen if she refused to comply? Would she face imprisonment, or worse, death? She had no answers, but she could already feel the eyes of those around her shifting, watching, waiting for her next move. Zora. The voice was familiar, yet it carried a heaviness that sent an unfamiliar chill down her spine. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Lucas stood in the doorway, his broad frame outlined by the soft light from the hallway. He had clearly been waiting for her, though the reason remained unclear. His presence wasn't comforting. It never had been. But there was something about him, something she couldn't place, that made him difficult to ignore. "I didn't expect to find you here," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. He didn't respond right away, studying her with those dark, guarded eyes. There was a conflict within him, something he wasn't saying. She could see it, just beneath the surface, a war waging between obligation and something deeper, more personal. "You left in a hurry," he said, his voice low. "You didn't even give them a chance to explain what the law means for you." Zora's jaw clenched. The last thing she wanted was to hear his opinions on the matter, especially not now, when everything felt like it was spiraling beyond her control. "The law doesn't need an explanation. It's as simple as that," she snapped. "A human mate. That's what they want. It doesn't matter that I didn't ask for it. It's law." Lucas's brows furrowed slightly, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "That's not what I meant." He stepped closer, each movement deliberate. "What happens to you, Zora? What happens if you don't comply?" She didn't need to answer that. The truth was clear enough, she would face the consequences, just as the law demanded. She'd have no choice. No choice but to bend, to obey. "I'll find a way out of this," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. "I'll find a way." The tension between them hung in the air, charged and thick. She could feel his eyes on her, studying, waiting for something more. "I know what you're thinking," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not just about you, Zora. There are consequences for everyone. For all of us." Zora's chest tightened. She had no intention of backing down, but hearing him speak those words, they carried weight. She had been so focused on her own anger, her own frustration, that she hadn't even considered what this law might do to the humans. "What do you want from me, Lucas?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "You seem to care about this, more than you let on. But why? Why should I trust you?" He paused, his face inscrutable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion, a fleeting vulnerability that caught her off guard. "Because," he started, his voice ragged with something unspoken, "I know what it's like to be trapped by something you can't change. You're not the only one whose life is being torn apart by this law. But we're all in this together now. Whether you like it or not." Zora inhaled sharply, her body feeling the weight of his words. There it was again. That strange tension. It wasn't just a human's desire for control or power. No. It was deeper than that. "You think this law is unfair," he added, almost as if reading her mind, "but you're not the only one who's been forced into a box. I've been forced into one too." The honesty in his voice made her falter. She didn't want to admit it, but there was something about him, something in the way he spoke, that made her wonder if he was being entirely truthful. "I can't just accept this," she whispered, her mind clouded with the sense of urgency that had settled in her chest. "There has to be another way. There must be." "You're right," Lucas agreed, his voice steady now. "But right now, you're not the only one feeling trapped. There are factions, humans and aliens both, that would use this law for their own gain. They don't care about you, Zora. They don't care about anyone. All they want is power. And that's the part you need to understand. There's a bigger game being played." Zora stared at him, her mind racing to process everything he was saying. She wasn't sure if she believed him, but she knew there was something more going on than she could see. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and Lucas stepped back, glancing over his shoulder. His gaze flickered back to her, the tension between them palpable, but he didn't speak again. "I don't trust them," Lucas muttered quietly, more to himself than to her. "I don't trust the law. But I do trust that we need to find a way out of this. Together." Zora's breath hitched, and for the briefest of moments, she wondered if she could. If she could trust him. As quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. Lucas was already walking away, his footsteps growing fainter as he disappeared into the maze of the building. Zora stood alone in the hallway, her heart racing, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She couldn't afford to trust him. Not yet. But somehow, some part of her, however small, wondered if he might be the key to unlocking the chaos that was about to consume them both. The city sprawled beneath Zora like an ever-growing labyrinth of glass and steel. From her vantage point high in the council building, the lights flickered like 1,000 distant stars, each representing lives, dreams, fears, and the intricate web of control that bound them all. The law. It had shattered everything she had believed in, and now, she could feel its consequences reverberating throughout every part of her life. But Lucas was right. This wasn't just about her. Not anymore. She had learned enough in the past few hours to understand that something darker was at play. The law that demanded alien women take human mates wasn't merely a decree from the council, it was a calculated maneuver, a piece in a larger, more dangerous game. Whoever was pulling the strings wasn't just after power. They wanted total domination. Zora's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a low knock at the door. She hadn't expected visitors, and certainly not this late. She approached cautiously, her hand hovering near the handle as she took a breath. When she opened it, Lucas stood there, his eyes shadowed, his body tense. "You didn't leave." She said it more as a statement than a question. He had told her earlier that he had to leave soon, but now, he stood there, looking like he was searching for something he wasn't sure he would find. "I couldn't," Lucas said, his voice low. "I didn't want to leave you alone with this." Zora studied him for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. The room was quiet, too quiet, as if the weight of the moment had settled over them both. Lucas paced in slow, deliberate steps, rubbing the back of his neck as he took in his surroundings. "Something's off, Zora," he said suddenly, his voice cracking with urgency. "I've been talking to a few people. People in high places, people I trust. They're worried. There's more to this law than what's being said." Zora's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" she asked, her words coming out sharp. She didn't need more cryptic warnings, not now. She needed action, answers. "Some of the humans are using this as leverage," Lucas continued, his eyes narrowing with concern. "The council's agenda is just the beginning. There's a faction trying to force all alien women into subservience. This law is just the first step. If they get what they want, they'll have complete control over all of us." Zora's stomach twisted into a knot. Control. That word had never sounded more ominous. "You're saying it's a trap?" she asked. "It's not just a trap. It's a war in the making," Lucas replied grimly. "And I'm telling you this now, because I've seen what these people can do. They don't care about the law. They care about power." Her mind raced, her eyes flicking over to the window as she tried to process his words. A war? That was beyond her comprehension. The law was bad enough, but this was something else entirely. "So, what do we do?" she asked, her voice firm. She couldn't afford to sit back and wait for the storm to hit. If there was a war coming, she would fight in it, no matter the cost. Lucas paused, then met her gaze, his face unreadable. "I have a plan. But you won't like it." Zora's eyebrows shot up. "I've never liked any of this, Lucas. So just tell me." "There's someone on the inside," he said, his tone lowering to almost a whisper. "Someone who can get us access to the inner circles of the council. If we're going to stop this before it gets worse, we need to expose the people pulling the strings." Zora stared at him. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the fact that someone so close to the council was willing to help them, or the fact that she might actually have to trust Lucas. "Who's this person?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. "I can't say yet," Lucas said, shaking his head. "I don't trust anyone except you right now. And that's the problem. I don't know who else I can count on." Zora's gaze softened, though her heart still pounded in her chest. The tension between them was thick, a heavy weight that neither of them could shake. She had never thought of Lucas as someone she could trust, but here he was, offering her something no one else had, a chance to fight back. She moved toward him slowly, her breath shallow. "I've been alone for so long, Lucas. I'm not used to trusting anyone. Not like this." She paused, her voice softening. "But if you're serious about stopping this, then we're in this together. For whatever it takes." Lucas met her gaze, his jaw tightening as he looked at her. I don't know what's coming, but I know this, we can't do this alone. As if on cue, a loud crash echoed from the hallway outside. Both of them froze, eyes wide, their bodies tensed. Zora's hand instinctively reached for the small weapon tucked at her waist, the one she had kept with her for as long as she could remember. I told you it was a war, Lucas whispered, his face a mask of determination. They're already coming for us. Before Zora could respond, the door burst open, and two heavily armed guards stepped inside, their eyes fixed on the pair with cold precision. They didn't say a word, just raised their weapons in perfect synchrony. Zora's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced at Lucas. There was no time for indecision now. She had to act, and she had to act fast. The tension that had been building between them broke in an instant. Go, she hissed, shoving Lucas toward the back exit. The guards were too close, their steps echoing in the hallway. Lucas didn't need another word. He bolted toward the door, pulling her behind him as they ran. The world outside the council building was no longer a sanctuary. The war had begun. And Zora knew, without a doubt, that she had no choice but to face it head-on. Zora's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she and Lucas sprinted through the labyrinth of corridors. The heavy footsteps of their pursuers echoed from behind, growing louder with every passing second. Her mind raced as the adrenaline coursed through her veins, pushing her forward, away from the danger that was closing in. She didn't know where they were running, only that they couldn't stop, not yet. She glanced over her shoulder, just in time to see one of the guards round the corner. His face was an unreadable mask, but the cold precision of his movements sent a shiver down Zora's spine. They were trained. And they weren't alone. Keep moving! Lucas barked, pulling her along, his grip tight on her wrist. His face was set, eyes scanning the narrow passageways ahead, always calculating. Zora couldn't help but notice the tense set of his jaw, the way his muscles seemed to coil with each step. What now? She asked, her voice ragged. She wasn't used to being hunted, to running from people who knew how to fight, how to kill if necessary. The council had kept their actions hidden for so long, she never imagined it would come to this. We need to get to the docks, Lucas replied, glancing at a side door. There's a way out of the city from there. But we have to move fast. Zora nodded, trusting him despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. He seemed to know this city, its underbelly, its hidden routes, better than anyone she had ever met. She couldn't deny the urge to trust him, but the deeper question lingered at the back of her mind, could he be hiding something? Or worse, could he have been part of this from the beginning? Her thoughts were interrupted as they reached a narrow stairwell. It was dark, save for the dim glow from a few flickering bulbs overhead. They descended quickly, trying to remain as quiet as possible, but the sound of boots against metal reverberated down the stairwell. Lucas, she whispered urgently, we can't keep running forever. I know, he said, his voice hard. But we don't have a choice. Not yet. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and Lucas pulled her toward a small door. The metallic clang of their pursuers' boots echoed in the distance, and Zora could feel the sweat trickling down her back. With a swift motion, Lucas yanked open the door, revealing a narrow, dimly lit alleyway. It smelled of damp stone and something sharp in the air. He ushered her through, keeping a lookout as they moved deeper into the alley, away from the bright lights of the city. What's at the docks? Zora asked, her curiosity overtaking the fear still clouding her mind. Ships. Old ones. They're used for more than just transport, some of them are neutral ground, Lucas replied. He didn't meet her gaze, but the way his jaw clenched told her he wasn't saying everything. Zora didn't press him. There wasn't time for questions right now. But the uncertainty in his voice, that hesitation, something was off. They reached the end of the alley and paused, hidden in the shadows. Lucas pulled out a small device from his pocket and held it up, scanning the street ahead. Zora's heart pounded, her instincts on high alert. "Something's wrong," he muttered, his eyes flicking over the screen. "What's wrong?" Zora asked, leaning closer to him. Lucas's gaze darted to her, his expression darkening. "The guards, they're on the move. They're not just searching, they're closing off every route out of the city. They know where we're headed." Her chest tightened. "Then we're trapped." "No," Lucas said firmly. "Not yet. Follow me." He moved quickly, slipping down another alley, and Zora followed, her legs aching from the sprint, but her fear pushing her onward. They reached the outskirts of the city soon enough, the towering buildings giving way to smaller structures and industrial sites. The docks loomed ahead, dark and quiet under the moonless sky. "We're close," Lucas whispered. "Stay low." They moved cautiously toward the edge of the docks, the sound of waves crashing softly against the shore in the distance. But there was no time to relax, no time to revel in the fact that they had made it this far. As they approached the entrance to the pier, a familiar voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Hold it right there." Zora's breath caught in her throat. She spun toward the sound, and there, standing in the dim light, were two more guards, their weapons trained directly at them. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The only sound was the distant rush of the ocean waves. Zora's pulse thundered in her ears as her mind scrambled for a way out, but there was none. She glanced at Lucas, who was already stepping in front of her, his hand reaching for something inside his jacket. "Step away from the docks, now," the first guard ordered. Lucas didn't move, his stance still firm. "You don't want to do this." "I don't think you have a choice," the second guard sneered, his fingers tightening around his weapon. Zora felt a chill run down her spine. This was it. They had nowhere left to run. But then, just as she was about to brace herself for the worst, a loud explosion rang out from further down the dock. The guards froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. For a brief second, confusion broke the tension. That was all it took. Without thinking, Lucas lunged, grabbing Zora's wrist and pulling her toward the nearest ship, a dark, hulking vessel docked just ahead. "Move," he shouted. They sprinted for the ship, just as the guards regained their composure. The sound of boots pounding against the ground grew louder, but Zora felt something shifting within her, a surge of desperation and determination. Lucas didn't look back, but Zora did. The guards were closing in, their guns raised, and for a moment, she thought she could see the flicker of a smile on one of their faces. They had her cornered. Except they didn't. Not yet. "Lucas," she shouted, her voice sharp with fear. "We need to move faster." But the ship was still too far away. Too many feet to cover. The tension stretched thin, and in the split second before everything seemed to collapse, a shadow moved from behind them. Zora didn't see it coming, didn't hear it until it was almost too late. Then everything exploded into chaos.